Prologue. People seem nicer these days. Most of them, anyway. It's as though anyone who doesn't see you as a threat or a meal is immediately accepted as a friend. I suppose that's the way it should be. Perhaps the way it should always have been, minus the meal bit. That's something that never should have entered the equation. Oh, but it has. It certainly has. My name is Hemp Chatsworth. My friends call me Hemp, and pretty much everyone who hasn't given me reason to feel otherwise is my friend these days. These days of zombies. We avoided saying the word as long as we could, but these are reanimated corpses and deteriorating human beings without pulmonary functions or any other vital signs, who are actively seeking us for a food source. And isn't that the very definition of the once fictional zombie? Of course it is. It works. The one piece of their anatomy that still functions in any way is the brain, and it's making frightening judgments that affect those of us who are still alive in a horrid way. It tells them they are ravenously hungry, and that flesh is the solution to their craving. Human flesh. Our flesh. We've discovered, over time, there are two types of zombies, as I alluded to. The ones who contracted the disease while living, and those who were buried and exposed to an element coming out of what I believe to be the Earth's core. I've come up with a hypothesis, through my observations and subsequent testing, that a fissure formed in the very nucleus of the planet, and a gaseous element of unknown origin, has begun to emit from nearly every surface of the Earth. You may wonder why I say it's of unknown origin when I also stated its most likely source is the Earth's core. Because, as the planet formed, any number of things could have happened to insert or create this vapor. The fact is, we'll never know. It will remain a mystery to mankind. But we do know what we have to do. We all realize what is necessary to put this planet right again, if it's even possible. We have to kill them all. Each and every one of them. And because I've made a well-educated guess as to how many of them there are versus how many of us there are, I can tell you with some level of certainty that there are 10 of them to every one of us. That directly translates to the odds against us in no uncertain terms. And that's why people say 10 to 1 this and 10 to 1 that. 10 to 1 odds suck if you're on the 1 side. You're very sure of yourself if you're on the 10 side. Let me interrupt myself for a brief moment to tell you this. Don't dare bet against us, because every time we run into a large group of them, each of us takes down our 10. Whittling away. That's how it's going to have to be done. The odds get better for us with every dead ghoul and digger. I have no idea, nor do Flex, Jem, or Charlie, how well other survivors are doing out there bringing them down. I hope our belief that they're figuring out how to defend against the creatures and how to eradicate them is accurate, because unless they do, that aforementioned ratio of zombies to uninfecteds isn't going to move in our favor very quickly. So, as Flex and Jem did in their Chronicles, I'll begin by telling you a bit about me and how I got to where they found me, in that jail cell in Tallahassee. I believe Flex mentioned what I said about heading down from Atlanta to see Kennedy Space Center for the first time. And it's on that trip that I became permanently sidetracked. I suppose I'm lucky I ended up where I did. Had I not, I never would have met my best friends in the world, which means I never would have met my wife. Charlie Sanders was her name before she married me in that little West Virginia church. She still cringes at the combination of her name and my last. Charlene Chatsworth reminds one a bit less of the late silent film actor Charlie Chaplin, but that's not her. Charlie has changed me. Not only my outlook on this new, very strange life we're living, but my hope for the future. She's a firecracker with a lit fuse, and I'm the happiest expat you'll ever meet. That woman transformed my heart and made me smile more in the last few months than I had since my first wife died in childbirth with my newborn son. I won't get into that part of my life because it's not relevant. If you're reading this, then you want to know, I believe, what we did and how we survived, how we interacted and how we dealt with this apocalypse. Apocalypse. I've never called it that before, and yet that's what it is. A bloody apocalypse if there ever was one. The more I write, the more I wonder how Flex and Jem got through their Chronicles. There's so much to share with you that I almost don't know where to begin, because my mind keeps skipping to other parts of the story. I might have a touch of the attention deficit disorder. I'd have just written ADD, but in print it just appears that I wrote the word add with the caps lock key stuck on. But when there is so much to consider and so many things to analyze, I think a bit of ADD is good. See? Well, I suppose I'll tell you a bit about myself. I know you probably feel as though you know me, but here's the thing. I lied to Flex and Jem. Charlie's the only one who knows the truth. Let me start a bit further back before the lie. There are some things you might wonder about. It's true that when I was 6 years old, my father used to pick up broken handguns from pawn shops in and around the area I lived, South Yorkshire, in the northern part of England. While it is true that pawn shops in England do not sell firearms of any kind, at least not over the front counter, there is a black market far beneath the visible one. One should not believe for a moment that pawnbrokers are not approached with merchandise, both legal and illegal, of every kind. And some of this merchandise could clearly use the assistance of a curious and, I'll admit, talented boy. My father realized right away that funds accumulated in this manner could build quickly, and would be a nice turnabout of money for our family. He initially had some great difficulty in this regard, as guns are practically non-existent in normal English society, and even many criminals have never actually seen or owned one. So, when a man, my father, who was not known for his underworld reputation or control over hired muscle, began contacting the very men who ran in that shadowed world, saying his genius son could take one look at the weapons and know exactly what needed to be done to either convert or repair them, he was turned away. It literally took over a year of effort before one crook named John Aarons agreed to let my father take 6 replica guns made in Germany to convert into workable handguns. It was the most fun I'd ever had at 7 years old. They'd had to provide a special grinder, but with that tool I was engrossed, both before and after my school day was done, and the first guns were all successes. The best part was, when they saw the results, they let me keep the grinder. It wasn't long before several CS gas-firing guns were brought to me for conversion, after which each was capable of accurately firing 9mm bulleted ammo. Even in an area the size of Rotherham in South Yorkshire, people knew one another. My father had taken me into the pawn shops many times to buy this or that, always negotiating everything down for me. When he went in the back, well, that's when I got most excited. I knew that's where all the good stuff was hidden, out of sight of the authorities. And I knew someone had dropped off more inventory for him, and me. As long as all the parts to a particular gun were there, even if just thrown into a box, I had the patience, even as a young fellow, to straighten, polish, and reassemble them. I never had bullets, which were almost as difficult to obtain as the weapons themselves, but I had no doubt they would operate perfectly. Specification manuals, micrometers, calipers, a small air compressor, and pneumatic tools for honing cylinders. All the tools of the trade, mostly purchased at my first supply stores, pawn shops. So, in my spare time, that's all I did, and I always had several guns in progress. If there was no way to fabricate a part for a particular gun, then we'd just search for another of the same type, and eventually I'd find the part I needed in working order. My father worked in the steel industry, which was quite prominent back then in Rotherham. When I was lacking a tiny part, he'd bring home little remainders of steel in various shapes and sizes, and I'd choose from among them for my lump of clay, so to speak. I would painstakingly grind and polish them until they were suited to my needs. When I was done refurbishing a handgun, or any other type of gun for that matter, my father would pack it inside a secret compartment under the back seat of his car and run it back to the pawnbroker who had fed him the pieces, and was paid handsomely for my work. My father was committed to keeping those funds separate from my education, and he was diligent about it. So, when I was 17, having graduated from handguns, shotguns, and rifles to semi-automatic and automatic weapons of various kinds, my educational fund was well filled. Of course, we could not change the way we lived, for it would do nothing but draw undue attention. So, in a box, hidden in the floor, for years and years, went my university fund. Ultimately, we had claimed I had received a scholarship from the Georgia Institute of Technology, where I would study mechanical engineering. We carried that a bit further, also claiming the receipt of a scholarship at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where I eventually secured my epidemiology degree. I was an excellent student, so nobody had any difficulty believing this story. I was traveling to America to attend university, and my family was proud. My schooling involved years of effort and hard work, but it was very worth it in retrospect. As for my accent, I could have lost it. The thing was, when I arrived in America, I was far beyond where many students were, and for some reason my British accent seemed to inspire people to listen to me. I'm not sure why. Americans seem to have some fascination with those with British accents, attributing either intelligence or some sort of coolness to them. In my case, I assume it was solely intelligence. I didn't fight it, for it was effective, so despite some teasing in my earlier years, the accent remains and is beyond the point that I'd even worry about disguising it. Now, the truth about my parents. It's not a big deal or a revelation, but I wanted to say it. I was speaking on the phone with them the day before I met Flex and Jem, the very morning, in fact. My mum and dad were describing the same horrible things that I would soon discover were going on here in America, only it began in the mines there a day or two before. They explained to me that upon running a car of miners up from deep in the mine at Maltby in South Yorkshire, just 7 miles from where they lived in Rotherham, something went terribly wrong. They were the canaries in a coal mine, literally. The forebears of all we've seen happen since. Deeper underground than anyone else, subject to the zombie gas before the general population. The men that came up in the car were no longer men. Not anymore. But it took a few precious minutes for the people waiting for them above ground to figure that out. They were, as described by the miners on the surface, insane. Vicious, attacking men with no concern with and no awareness of anything around them. They caught many of their co-workers on the surface by surprise. Nobody knew their outstretched arms were to grab and attack people, pull them in and eat them. With their black faces, it was not easy to tell their skin had become white-gray beneath. They'd looked like any other miners, except, people reported, for their eyes. Something had definitely changed about them, but nobody noticed changes they had no reason to look for. Not until they began biting. Before that, they assumed that some hugs were needed after a long day in the mine, according to my mother. When I had spoken to my mum, she told me the next day nothing else had been reported. The news had gone silent on the miner story, and no public health warnings had been issued. When she told me of the story, it was with fascination, nothing else. There was no concern, no fear, just a matter-of-fact, strange but true story. And then she told me of her headache. Her very, very bad headache. Of course, good son that I am, I suggested she take a couple of aspirin or Tylenol and get some rest. Turns out my mum wasn't immune to urushiol. That's my guess anyway. I had a mobile phone in that jail cell too, and it worked for a while, even in there. But calls to my mum and dad never resulted in an answer. I left a message that I fear will forever go unheard. As for my father, either my mum attacked him or he wasn't immune either. While I don't want to make any assumptions about whether they're dead or alive, all I know is that I love and miss them terribly. It had been nearly 6 years since I'd seen them before I locked myself in that jail cell in Tallahassee to escape people very similar to the zombie miners in Maltby, Sheffield. Now the outbreak is no longer just the mystery of the miners. It is the mystery of our time. So, I suppose it was easier to tell Flex and Jem that my parents had died, without really specifying when or how. I knew they had too much consideration to ask, assuming I'd tell them when I was ready. I love them, so I'll probably tell them sometime. In the meantime, I can talk about everything with my Charlie, and that's good enough. It's hard not knowing if your parents are alive or dead, even when in your heart you believe the latter to be more likely. It occasionally takes hold of my emotions and distracts me from the many tasks ahead. I've got no brothers or sisters, and with my parents likely dead, I would be utterly alone if not for my wife and my new friends. Now, I suppose it's time I stop dawdling and get on with telling you about my beginning in this new world.